Well, last week we saw a lot of different conditions that are needed to define what's hasagas gavul and what's not hasagas gavul. And so we're going to go and we're going to see some of those examples that we had talked about in that English halachapedia. Um, and so the last thing that we had said is that if a person is in the midst of negotiating a purchase, you don't have a right to interfere with that person's process by trying to swoop in and undercut them and take the deal away from them. And that's a case of ani hamahapech bechurara, right, or hasagas gavul, different terms for the same idea of taking away someone's work that they had invested in and their hopes of getting a deal, and you coming and take it away from them. And so in halacha yud aleph, we're going to see some more conditions for that. So the Rav Shulchan Aruch writes, he says, "V'chol zeh b'shekvar pasku hadomim, hakona v'hamocher." All of the aforementioned that we've restricted you from, trying to take away someone else's deal, is when the buyer and seller have already arranged on the terms of the sale. In other words, they've already arranged on the price. Ve'ein mechusarin elaki. And the only thing that they lack right now is going through the transaction legalistically, signing the contract or making a kinyan by transferring, physically and so forth. Aval im lo hushvu adain bepisuk damim. But if they haven't yet arrived at an agreed upon price, shahamoche rotze bekach v'halokech rotze bekach, where the buyer wants to sell it at one price and the seller wants to sell it at one price and the buyer wants to buy it at another price, mutter la'acher liknos, then it is permitted for another person to come in and to offer his price. In other words, if they're still in the process of negotiation, and by the way, we're going to see the Imrei Yaakov is going to qualify this further. If, let's say, a guy's interested in purchasing a home and there's been no paperwork yet, but they're still negotiating on price, so then I'm allowed to come in, Shimon is allowed to come in, let's say, and undercut Ruvain, and Ruvain will actually be quite resentful because he was in the process of haggling, he was in the process of negotiating him downwards, and all of a sudden I come in and I take it away from him. So he says technically that's halachically permissible, and the reason is shelo asu chachamim takana lahafsid hamocher, because the chachamim made no kind of remedy to cause the seller to lose money. In other words, what you're going to say basically, this buyer is in the midst of negotiation. He's trying to get away with paying, let's say, 90% of the purchase price, and a guy is willing to pay 100% of the purchase price. Why would the chachamim protect the buyer so much at the expense of the seller? So that's already where the chachamim will not step in. Okay, shekeshiyavo echad liknos v'yifsak lo ma'atomim yitztarech limkar lo. He says the rabbis are not going to step in and just because someone has lowballed and has offered a low price, the chachamim are not going to say, okay, no one else can come in until they've finished, right? That's not fair to the seller. Im lo yihye rashai shuv shum adam lavo liknosa. If we're going to say that no one else can now come in and buy it, that's putting the seller at a disadvantage. The free market is, whatever the price will be, whatever the market will bear. And if you're going to say that as soon as one person puts forward an offer, no one else is allowed to step in until the negotiations are finished with the first offer, that doesn't seem fair to the seller. Va'afilu im hamocher hu einu Yehudi lo chalku chachamim. And that's true even if the seller is a non-Jew. The chachamim are not here to protect a Jew who's coming in to lowball an offer. Aval im hushbu b'pisuk damim aser la'acher lahosif damim afilu hamocher hu Yisrael. But by contrast, if let's say the seller and the buyer have already agreed upon a price, and then all of a sudden Shimon comes along and he says, you're selling it to him for what? I would have given you 20% more. I'm still willing to do the deal. Just figure out a way to get out of that. Did you sign the contract yet? No. So then sell it to me. I'll sell it. I'll pay you 20% more than what the guy's offering. That's usser. And that's true even if you want to argue, well, the seller's a Jew. Why shouldn't the Jew make more money? No, sorry. There's integrity. They've already agreed upon a price, and you've got to honor that. It's an usser for you to go in and try to undercut after they've already agreed on a price. Ele imkein halokeachu nachri. And however, if the buyer is a Gentile, the rabbis will not prevent a Jew from coming in and undercutting him. That is permitted. So this is again another situation where there's a different standard between Jews and non-Jews in a particular halacha. When the buyer, who's the first, Reuven, comes along and he's Jewish, and he's already agreed on a price with the seller, but they haven't made a kinyan yet, then the rabbi said, listen, he's your brother. Don't darchei shalom. Try to get along with everybody. You'll find another deal around the road. When the first buyer is a Gentile, then there's no such provision that we have to stop everyone else from coming along just because they've already agreed on a price. There, you are allowed to undercut a Gentile, provided that they haven't made a transaction yet. V'yesh omrim, and there are some people who say, Shebischirus batim min hanachrim yesh chayim rabbeinu gershom shelo lahasig gevul afilu im lo hushvu adayin b'pisuk damim. And some say that when it comes to renting houses, there's a chayim rabbeinu gershom. Now, Rabbeinu Gershom lives in the 10th century, 10th, 11th century, and he made a number of general rules that a lot of you are familiar with. For example, he said, don't take a second wife. You can only marry one wife. There's a lot of other things that are chayrim of Rabbeinu Gershom, that he instituted a lot of rules of etiquette within society that were not formalized until his time. Another thing that he ruled was that you're not allowed to read someone else's mail, and certain other things that he instituted. So one of the things that he instituted, according to this opinion, is that once a person has agreed upon a rent for a rental of a piece of real estate, you're not allowed to try and undercut that person, even if they haven't agreed upon a price. And what we're talking about here is where a person is a tenant. What we're talking, as you'll see in just a moment, a person is a tenant in a house, right, or an apartment, and someone else wants to rent that same apartment. So the landlord, Reuven has been in the apartment for a year, and the landlord wants to raise his rent. And they're in the midst of negotiation as far as how much Reuven is willing to pay for the new year's rent. And Shimon comes along and says, well, if you're raising his rent and he's giving you a hard time, I can always come in and pay you 20% more than what Reuven's paying. So Rabbeinu Gershom said you're not supposed to do that. If a guy's already living in a home or in an apartment, and you, even though, every new year is a new lease, you're still not allowed to try and undercut him, because that's going to create undue hardship upon him. He's going to have to pack up his whole house, pack up his whole apartment, and move and find another place to live. That's not right, said Rabbeinu Gershom. And that's true even if they haven't agreed upon a price. They're still in negotiations to determine what the tenant will pay for the new year. Right? And sometimes a landlord could unfairly exploit a tenant. And he could say to him, I want you, that's why we have rent control, that you're not allowed to raise the rent beyond a certain amount of money, because there are landlords who will say, well, I could easily rent this out for much more money because you've been living here for the last 25 years. And that's this, as you can imagine, that's the basis for the chayrim of Rabbeinu Gershom, is because it was a form of rent control, that you're not that there was any restriction on how much a landlord could raise the rent, but at least what he did was he forbade any new person from coming into a person who's already a tenant on a property and trying to get them off that property. Okay, so let's take a look
And
now.
and
Yeah, Izzy.
and today and today you can't even kick out a tenant,
What do you mean?
even if you want to take it for a condo or like you said, raise the rent. You can't. It's very difficult today to kick out a tenant, even for a reason, because the government doesn't want all these people hanging around on the street. And besides the people who are living there, like if you have a tenant in your basement, for example, very difficult to get rid of them.
Oh, okay. All right. So you're speaking. It
And
seems like you're speaking from experience.
yeah, in my old house, we rented out the basement. Also, when you're making a real estate deal today, I mean, once somebody puts in an offer, and I think you have 24 hours to negotiate, nobody else can put in an offer on buying a house,
Right.
right? Like
Right.
we've all bought a house. Most
Yeah.
of us have
So
bought
so so
houses.
so today, obviously the law of the land will prevail if there are certain strictures that go beyond this halacha. Obviously, we understand that, but this halacha, what we're learning in the halacha is that even where the law of the land does not place any restrictions and requirements, these are your minimal requirements according to halacha. Okay, so now let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. Ve'ein mechusarin elakinyan. The only thing that's lacking is the transaction. That's where the Rav Shulchan Aruch says that you're not allowed to swoop in and try to undercut the transaction. So he says, Nira dahosif bazeh, da'af im hushvu b'pisuk damim, mikol makom shari kevin shelo hushvu b'sha'ar tenoim, kagon hovala o tenai tashlumin uchedoima. So what the Imrei Yaakov is inferring from this language is that even according to this opinion, even if they've agreed on a price, but they haven't agreed to other terms, like for example, the terms of payment. In other words, are you going to pay me in installments? Is it what is it called, net 90 or something, net 30, net 60, net 90? Um, how are you going to pay me? Now, are you going to pay me in installments, or are you going to pay me up front? Is it going to be in cash, or is it going to be having to deal with banks? What about the delivery of the goods? Are you going to take delivery by sending your truck, or do I have to hire a truck to send it to you? Right. So there could be other terms of negotiation that have to be worked out in addition to the price. And what it seems like when the Rav Shulchan Aruch is saying is that the only thing that is lacking is the actual formal transaction, implies that all of the terms have been worked out, not just on the price. And therefore, what the Imrei Yaakov is inferring is that technically, if they've already agreed on a price, but they're still squabbling on some of the other details of the deal, it would technically be permitted for someone else to come in and say, I'll meet that price, but I'll pay you all cash up front, so you don't have to worry about payment in installments, and that is legal according to the way that the Imrei Yaakov is understanding it. So mutter la'acher liknos, kain kasav harama. So all of that we've quoted up until now is according to the Rama in Shulchan Aruch. But then the Imrei Yaakov brings the opinion of the Prisha, which is one of the early commentaries to the Torah from I believe I think it's 18th century. He says, Kasav al Zevis Elashon, he writes as follows, Ve'ata nohagim lifsok achayotze bazeh, shehu hasagas gavul. He says, however, our minhag today, says the Prisha, is that even that is encroaching, even before they've agreed on all terms. V'lichora nira lechalek, d'cheshaba echad liknos davar mehasheni, u'mechulakim b'pisuk damim. He says, and the Prisha therefore then says that it really all depends on the nature of the deal. So there's one scenario where Ruvain is trying to buy from the seller, and they can't agree on a price. Ze omer kachehu b'shisha. The seller wants to sell it for 6, V'zeh omer tinehu ba'arba, and the buyer Ruvain wants to pay 4. Umisaskim b'pisuko, v'zeh lahosif v'zeh ligroa. And so now they're in the process of haggling, right? In other words, they're trying to figure out who's going to win in this negotiation process. V'lulei shabah hashlishi hayumashvim nafsham. And if it weren't for the fact that Shimon comes along and says, "I'll pay you 6," they would have eventually come to a settlement somewhere in between 4 and 6. So zem mikri gamkein hasagas gavul. So if the rabbis see that kind of scenario where Shimon is ruining the negotiation process, then that's also called hasagas gavul, and that's also aser. V'hada amar rushaenu nikra hasagas gavul ad sheyihiyu mushavim bepisuk. He says, and when, under what circumstances is it not hasagas gavul if they haven't agreed on price? Hainu kishalokeach halach mehamocher v'amar lo eten yoser mizeh. That's only when the buyer has said, "This is my final price, and I can't go any higher." So in that situation, says the Prisha, only in that situation is it permitted for Shimon to come in and offer a higher price. So this places clear further restrictions. This commentary of the Prisha, he's basically saying that even when the price has not been agreed upon yet, but they're still in the midst of negotiation, it's not fair for someone to come along and to try to disrupt that negotiation process. Give the guy a chance. Give them a chance to have a meeting of the minds. You know, we're still in the process of negotiation. By you coming in and trying to get it for and your willingness to pay a higher price, completely destroys my opportunity to finish off the business deal that I've invested so much in. So certainly it is understandable what the Prisha is saying. And it's one of those gray areas where you have one opinion that says, no, if they're still negotiating, it's still fair game, anyone can come in. But the Prisha says no. If they're still in the process of negotiation, the Prisha views negotiation as part of the transactional process is the negotiation. It's actually culturally and socially an accepted part of the whole transactional process. And therefore, for you to disrupt that, a third party to come in and disrupt that is wrong. Interesting difference in perspective, but clearly there's a machlokas over here.
Rabbi, today what a lot of real estate agents are doing is they're showing like an open house for a while, and then they decide, let's say they have the open house on a Sunday, and they say on Tuesday we're taking our offers. So a bunch of people go in and put their offers in. There could be multiple Jewish people doing that. So then how would that work? Now you have Jew against Jew bidding for the house.
Yeah, it's totally fair game. No one has come in first and begun a process of negotiation where a second person is like the Johnny come lately in that case. Everyone, it's an open market. Everyone has been given the same opportunity, and everyone's coming in at the same time. Like the realtor has said, we're taking bids starting Tuesday, and anyone who has the best offer. And by the way, a lot of times a seller will give to a lower offer if he sees that the buyer is a more attractive buyer. You know, like we learned before, sometimes it's let's say the credit rating of the buyer. Does the buyer come with reliable credit? And what about the escrow terms? Sometimes one buyer will come and say he'll give cash up front for the purchase of the home. He'll come with a valise full of $100 bills, and the other guy says, no, I want a 90-day escrow. I need to get a loan, and that also could play a role. And that's all. But that's all fair game. That's an open market. That's fair, right? And that's just the nature of how real estate works in a densely populated frum neighborhood, is that it is typical to have two Jewish people competing for the same house. That's just normal. right? Okay. Shebeschirus batim. When it comes to renting homes, we talked about the cherem of Rabbeinu Gershom. He says, "V'chein Yisrael hador bebeis chaver b'schirus al shana." He says this was the example that we made, that if a person has been living in a house or an apartment for a year, Asr Yisrael acher leilech lebalabayis b'chalos hashana. It is asr for another Jew to come when the year lease is about to end, liskor mimenu la'atzmo, and say, I'd like to rent it instead. Afim adayin lo sikem haba'olim imarishon. If the owner of the house or the landlord has not yet agreed upon a new rental price, because the landlord is entitled to raise the rent, but if the tenant has not yet agreed to pay that amount of a raise, it's usher for another guy to come in and try to pull it away from the first guy. Because there it's also like a case of ani hamahapech b'charara, where the poor person is prospecting on the garbage heap. The pisuk damim also lo gam l'shana hashniya kol zman shelo nishtana ha'inyan b'neihem. He says it's the first tenant's first rights of refusal. In other words, you have to give him that opportunity to be able to figure out how to make the second year's raise and to negotiate over it. As long as as long as things have not substantively changed between the landlord and the tenant. In other words, it's not right for someone to try and get the guy kicked out of his apartment. But I mean, obviously, if the landlord is unhappy with the tenant for other reasons, and he turns to a third party and says, "I'm not happy with this guy. I plan to kick him out of the apartment." At that point, I guess it would be okay for the guy to say, "Well, if you have a vacancy, my nephew is looking for a place to rent. There's nothing wrong with that." Once the landlord has said, "I'm kicking this guy out," but before that, as if there's no reason to kick the guy out of the apartment, and they're just in the process of negotiating terms for the next year's lease, no one has a right to try and get the guy kicked out. All right, we'll have to hold it here for today. Because of Monday, I have to get ready. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and a Shavua Tov, and a good week. Take care now.